Night dissolved into the landscape, absolute and swift. The pale sapphire of the twilight sky did not merely set, it seemed to dissolve beneath the horizon. From the edges of the world, a luminous silver mist crept forward. What had been a distant shroud less than half a mile prior now stretched toward the encampment, unfurling long, spectral tendrils across the darkened plains. Nestled within this fog lay the camp, a collection of silken pavilions, both grand and small. At its heart stood a singular tent of pure white, gleaming softly in the gloom. Between the structures, the earth bore the tracks of the army's march. Along these deeply trodden pathways, a few scattered torches flickered. Their flames did not roar. Instead, they cast a dim, amber glow that bled into the mist, turning the air itself into a haze of gold and shadow. A profound, dreamlike stillness hung over the valley, less a simple quiet, and more a deep, enchanted peace. This was exactly what Rian had hoped for. Darkness. Quiet. Distraction. If he was going to speak with Adora unseen, tonight was the night. He had already removed most of his armor by this point, and had changed out of his green tunic and into a fitted white vest. The tent that was allocated to him had been furnished with a makeshift wooden bed, adorned with a few blankets. There was also a table, which he had placed all of his armor upon, as well as the sword he wore. A bowl of hot stew and a tankard of water were also placed on the table, which he was currently attending. Once the bowl was empty, he drank from the tankard, downing all its contents and setting it aside. He had been surprised at how awake he had felt, given that he had not slept since he had awoken from his injuries. There had been far too much happening and on his mind to even have a chance at rest. The tent's draping fabric at its entrance flapped wildly in the night's wind, occasionally revealing the darkness outside. It was time. Rian studied the contents of his belongings, but by the time he had looked at everything, the sword had made its way into his hands unknowingly. He must have known in his thoughts that he would need it before the night was over. He did not, however, attach it to his waist. Instead, he threw the strap over his shoulder and positioned the sword on his back, and threw over his gray cloak and fastened it at the neck, concealing the weapon beneath its folds. He then tossed the fold of the hood that hung behind it above his head and turned to leave the tent. He paused at the entrance. Beyond the canvas, laughter drifted from distant soldiers huddled around fires and the occasional clattering of horses stamping against the earth. Yet beneath it all was a silence he could not explain, as though the mist had swallowed the sounds before they could travel. He pushed aside the flap of the tent and stepped into the night. The cold struck him immediately, not the sharp cold of winter, but a damp chill that clung to his skin and settled beneath his clothes. The silver mist had drawn closer whilst he had been inside. What had once lingered at the edge of the camp now threaded itself between the tents, turning familiar shapes into pale silhouettes. A few soldiers still lingered around low-burning fires. Some laughed amongst themselves over tankards. Others sat sharpening blades or tending to the horses. None paid him any attention. Good, he thought. Rian pulled the hood lower over his face and made his way through the camp. The white command pavilion stood at the center of the encampment like a beacon. Beyond it, through gaps between the tents, he could occasionally glimpse the colossal ruins. This must be the bridge. Its towering pillars rose from the mist like the bones of some ancient beast. Every time he looked away and then back again, he could have sworn their shapes had changed slightly. He quickened his pace. Whether Adora intended to tell him the truth or not, tonight he would finally get some answers. The road towards the pavilion was a straight one, each side revealing a mix of shoddy and worn tents of varying hues of white and gray. Some had soldiers huddled around low fires, attempting to keep warm, whilst others had men drinking tankards of ale, boasting about the upcoming war. Rian kept his head down as he traveled, only looking at the ground that lay ahead of his feet. Once the clearing had widened, he knew he had reached his destination. To its right, he caught sight of the two wooden caravans, this time not being led by horses. They were covered in darkness. No torch lit up the area in which they had been placed, and only a soft glow emanated from the pavilion's entrance, bathing the ground in a welcoming light. He could see a soldier standing guard in the middle of both caravans. It was Garth. Garth looked up to the man who was a few meters in front of him and raised his hand to wave. Rian waved back in reply. He was glad that it was just Garth currently stationed here. It meant the following situation would be less difficult. But as he turned to head towards the caravans, he stopped suddenly, his head turning towards the pavilion. An idea came out of the blue. Before he spoke to Adora, he would find out exactly what Varric had planned. Whether he was going to travel along the bridge with his forces, or whether there was an alternative. Garth lowered his hand as he witnessed Rian not walking towards him, and instead disappearing into the pavilion. The warmth hit him first. Lanterns hung from wooden poles driven into the earth, bathing the pavilion in golden light. A long table dominated the center of the tent, its surface covered in maps, scraps of parchment, and half-finished tankards of ale. The smell of hot wax lingered in the air. Rian stood at the entrance and studied the tent's inhabitants. To his right stood two soldiers, holding spears in their right hands and looking towards the other two men, who were in the center of the room. The one to the left had his hands on the wooden table, leaning over it and looking at what the last person was doing. Standing central to these men was Varric, who seemed to be mid-writing on one of the pieces of parchment, the quill in his hand scratching at its paper. No one seemed to notice Rian enter at first, but it was Varric who raised his eyes first. The other men followed in turn. "Come in, why don't you?" Varric said. He placed the quill down on the table and began rolling up the parchment tightly. Rian strolled forward and saw the soldiers to his right walk forward to intercept him. "It's fine, we're done here anyway." Varric took hold of a small metal block with one hand and a small glass jar which had held the hot wax Rian had been smelling. He poured a little over the parchment seal and pressed the metal block into it firmly for a few seconds before releasing. It left an imprint of a symbol which Rian could not make out from this distance. Varric then handed the rolled-up parchment to the soldier who was leaning against the table, who then placed it gently into a leather satchel that hung around his waist. "Make sure this gets delivered into his hands only." The soldier nodded and turned to leave the pavilion. He slowed down slightly as he passed Rian, glancing at his face, before picking up his pace again and vanishing into the night. Varric began tidying up the contents on the table, putting scraps of paper in an iron chest that sat behind him, and eventually taking a seat. "What was that?" Rian asked, removing his hood. "Orders. He is going back to Nostrador with all speed," answered Varric. "Orders? I thought we have ours, but I have written for more troops and word about our encounter we had on the road." Rian tried to pick apart the words he had heard, desperate to find the lie, but it all sounded as honest as it could have, coming from Varric's lips. Varric gestured to the soldiers still in the tent to leave, and they scurried out. Rian heard them stop just outside the tent and take a place at either side of the entrance. "Thought you would be sleeping?" Varric asked, putting his feet up on the table and leaning back in his chair. Rian moved closer to the table and pulled up a seat to face Varric. "I wanted to talk to you actually about something one of the prisoners had said about the bridge," Rian said. Varric's eyes darted towards Rian across from him. "Let me guess. The bridge shouldn't be there, or it's in ruins, or we shouldn't go that way. Am I right?" Varric threw a finger down towards the table and pointed. Rian had not noticed that there was an outstretched piece of paper upon it. He swore that he had just seen Varric clear the table. The paper began to shift across the table as Varric placed his finger on a particular spot over and over again. Rian tried to see what it was exactly he was pointing at. And yet it is still there. Rian leaned up in his chair to get a better look, catching a small glimpse of what he thought was the bridge, drawn in red ink, but Varric swiftly began rolling up the paper. "I did tell you not to talk to them, did I not? Liars, the lot of them," Varric said, folding the rolled-up paper in half and shoving it within his belt. Why couldn't Rian find the will to challenge Varric on anything? He knew he should, but something was holding him back, and it had not been the first time. He felt it might have been intimidation at first. Varric was rather imposing, and his strategy in war had so far been aggression first, ask questions later. But if Rian was supposed to have been their general, then surely he too would feel the need to act this way. But he did not. Varric let out a sigh. "You're thinking too much again." This caught Rian slightly off guard. "What do you mean?" he replied. Varric rose from his seat and began to walk around the table to Rian. "Ever since you woke from your injuries, you have questioned almost every single thing, but we've told you not to worry." "We?" Rian replied. "Yes, we, not just myself, but the old man Sigrid, even young naive Garth out there." He placed what should have been a comforting hand on Rian's shoulder, but it felt more like a subtle threat. "You need to relax. I'll lead this attack for you. General." He eyed Rian judgmentally, letting out a snort and moving back to his seat at the other end of the table. Rian had no response. He could feel his patience for the man wearing extremely thin. He wanted to remove himself from this situation, and so he did. Without any more words uttered between them, he left, not turning back to Varric or even gesturing a goodbye. Outside, he saw the two soldiers on either side of him, and, to his far left, the carriages which contained Adora and the other prisoners. He noticed Garth had now moved towards her cell and seemed to be in deep conversation. Whether or not the soldiers saw the nod, Rian bowed at them before walking off towards Garth's location. Both Garth and Adora had not noticed Rian approaching. The darkness that hung around the caravans was deep, where the whites of their eyes could barely even be seen. Rian could hear them exchanging words the closer he got. Nothing majorly stood out to him, but as he got closer he heard Garth mutter, "I am beginning to remember," clutching at his necklace that hung from his neck. "That's good. We just have to make him see," replied Adora softly. As Rian approached, both Adora and Garth leapt up slightly. Garth threw himself back to his post, but eased as he saw who it was. Rian. You scared me there for a moment. I thought that you were—" "Varric?" Rian interjected. Garth nodded. Rian could tell the boy was breathing heavily. Adora looked past Rian at the pavilion and then back at him, noticing where he had just come from. "Did you find out anything?" she asked. Rian looked back at the tent. "Not exactly, but they are going to take the bridge, and soon." Adora turned her head towards the direction that the structure was located. "No," she suddenly said softly in a whimper. Garth moved a few paces forward, the light from the tent now adjusting to the darkness and making things a little easier to see. "They? You mean you don't plan to go with?" he questioned. Rian thought for a moment in silence. "It's clear he doesn't," Adora replied in his stead. Footsteps suddenly were heard a few feet away. Rian threw up his hood quickly, and Garth stood firm at the cage he was standing at. Adora did not react. Two men had been walking towards the pavilion, and suddenly vanished as they pulled open its cloth. Garth let out a breath of relief and loosened up slightly, his hand once again grasping hold of the necklace. More of the orange light from within the tent suddenly brought more of a glow to the mist that surrounded the clearing, including where the caravans were stationed. Rian and the others could now see one another a lot more clearly. He had noticed that within Adora's cell was another person, lying on their side and facing away from the three. He recognized it as the elf who had been placed on the back of one of Varric's men's horses. Adora saw that Rian had seen him. "He's fine, just exhausted," she spoke. "What a mess!" Garth suddenly exclaimed, letting go of his hold on the necklace and scratching vigorously above his ear. "You are right, Garth, you are right," Rian replied. But what Rian suddenly noticed next struck him to his core. His eyes drifted to where Garth had been scratching, and, thanks to the orange glow that filled the clearing now, saw something upon the top of not just one of his ears, but both. Roughly in the same position as where Rian had noticed his injuries on his ears had been, there were pale, white lines, scars even, that were curiously like his own. Garth continued scratching, absent-mindedly. He was saying words to Adora, but Rian wasn't listening anymore. His attention had fixed entirely upon the pale marks running along the tips of both ears. The same place. The same shape. His own hand rose instinctively to his own ear. It was not as painful as it had been, but there was still a slight pressure on the point he had felt. Garth had noticed Rian staring intently at him and began to feel a little uneasy. "What is it?" he asked him. Rian pointed to his own ears. Your ears, what happened?" Garth slid a hand over the tip of one of his ears a few times, aware that there was an unusual bump to it. I don't remember," he replied, letting out a chuckle. Adora's eyes moved from Garth to Rian, It was clear she knew something. Rian unknowingly began to slowly walk away from the pair. It was true what Varric had said before. He was thinking too much. He needed rest. Perhaps a good night's sleep would help him fathom everything that was on his mind. He let his feet take him back in the direction of where his tent lay. Behind him he could hear Adora say, as quietly but still audible, "Wait, we haven't talked yet. Please come back." Before he knew it, her voice had trailed off, and he found himself standing in his own tent. He took off his gray cloak, threw the sword on the floor, and lay down upon the makeshift bed in the corner. No more tonight. No more. He muttered to himself and let sleep take him. The warmth of sunlight. Birds. Leaves moving overhead. A man's voice. "You're holding it wrong." Again. "Your stance is too wide." An old man's laughter. "One day you'll understand. But when that day comes, trust your heart before your eyes." The voice fades. The sunlight became silver mist. The trees became pillars. A stone bridge appeared. Rian suddenly jolted upright. Cold sweat beaded upon his brow, despite the cold air that lingered within the tent. He wasn't too sure what had awoken him from his sleep until he heard the sound of a familiar horn being blown. It blew again, and then again. The sounds of soldiers frantically marching could be heard from outside, and there were raised voices. Rian sat upright, pulling the blanket up to his neck to keep in the warmth. He could see the early morning light shining through the entrance of his tent, a welcome change from the dark that had been there moments ago. How long was I asleep for? He thought to himself, but he already knew what was happening. It had started. Gathering up his belongings, he hastily threw on his armor that was scattered along his tent, tightened up the straps on his boots, and went to place his sword on his waist. But he could not find it. It had not been on the table where the rest of his stuff had been. He looked back and forth a few seconds before catching a glint of something reflective on the floor. It was his sword. He slowly bent down and picked it up, eyes fixed on its hilt. The horn blew again. This time the noise dragged out longer. Rian shook off the last remnants of sleep and stepped out into the dawn. Beyond the camp, hidden within the morning mist, the bridge awaited.